Hello, everyone. It's a bright and insanely hot day here in Las Vegas. We will probably hit 105 degrees Fahrenheit. But I thought I would take a moment simply to read you another one of my favorite scenes from my most recent novel, In Plain Sight. We're now deep in the book. We are now heading toward that final confrontation, the final conflict. And we've had a scenario where the men of the house, if you will, that would include not only Mr. Smith, but also Richard Fitzwilliam and Edward Benton, have somehow managed to concoct a plot to capture a rather bad person who is threatening Smith and Elizabeth. But Lizzie, in her more impertinent self, finds that the plans these men have made have not included any input from any of the women. Not herself, not Mary, not even Annie Wilson. So without further ado, I'm going to just kind of read a selection from chapter 38 of In Plain Sight. This is a scene late at night after everyone has tried to go to sleep. Smith has been laying on a couch in the parlor of the St. Margaret's Vicarage, but he can't sleep. So he thought he might go into the library, as they always seem to do in Pride and Prejudice, to find a book to help him doze off. He goes in, opens the door, after opening the door, and sees Lizzie, not Elizabeth in this guise, Lizzie, sitting in a chair with her feet tucked underneath her, wrapped in a shawl, wearing her night rail. And so it's a long segment. I'm going to do my best not to tang my tongue, and we'll go from there. So from chapter 38 of In Plain Sight, I'm going to be looking down to read. Thank you. Not wishing to startle her overmuch, Smith cleared his throat. Her head snapped up and turned his way at the sound. At first, her widened eyes and mouth shaped into an O of surprise that led Smith to believe that she welcomed his interruption. Then again, maybe she had done so because, as it turned out, the lady had much in her craw that she needed to unleash. Her eyes narrowed, and a hardened glint flashed at Will, who had the good sense to brace himself for the oncoming tempest. Lizzie's feet hit the floor with an audible slap. She vaulted upright, grabbed the hems of the blanket embracing her, and marched across the room until her upraised chin struck Smith's breastbone. She poked with that unique appendage and slammed her knuckles, full of woven wool, into his ribs until he gave way. Once she had established her superior position, her verbal assault began. "How dare you?" she burned, eyes flashing with rage. "How dare you presume to conclude on your own what is best for both of us? Am I too frail, too weak, or too insipid to be able to determine how I want my own life to be shaped? So you wish to leave, to protect us, to protect me. Wonderful. Just when were you planning to discuss this momentous decision? Or were you simply going to leave a letter tipped against a vase on the mantelpiece?" Then she poked his chest with her forefinger, stiffened now that it had been so appealing just a moment before. Elizabeth lowered her voice into a simmering fury. "I thought we had an understanding, Mr. Smith, that we were destined to be partners as we move toward the future, together. What was it about the appearance of your nemesis, Watkins and Lambton, that threw over everything about which we have talked during the past fortnight? Or was all this a ruse, and you were merely trying, for even baser purposes, to turn the head of the maiden you already disgraced? I thought you were a changed man, that your trials had altered your basic nature, but you still are one of them." Smith was rocked back on his heels by her anger, her venom, her accusations. He had never once considered that Elizabeth would be anything but pleased to be out of harm's way. He had assumed that she would realize that he could do nothing else but act to protect his beloved in the only way he could ascertain, even to the extent of turning himself over to the authorities. That is what a gentleman did, except that he was a gentleman no longer. Then comprehension dawned. Her entire discourse in the Glen had been about freedom, about the smashing of proprietary structures, and gentle behavior by their mutual descent in status. Elizabeth saw herself as his equal, a partner willing to share both joy and hardship in equal measure. Yet the words she overheard that afternoon said nothing about sharing, love, or partnership. Rather, they spoke to her of pride, conceit, and abandonment. How wounded and exposed she must feel to think that the one person she trusted is willing to leave her behind. She does not understand that I've been the author of her misery, and I am fully aware of my guilt in the matter. All she sees is that I am fickle and uncaring. His mien must have betrayed deeper unhappiness. Elizabeth read this expression as one of discomposure at being found out. "Oh, do not play the injured innocent with me, sir," she snapped. "You may call yourself Smith, but I do not doubt that your name is something quite different and quite well known. I have long harbored suspicions that you were a gentleman fallen far from your previously lofty perch. Now I understand that you may be disgraced, but your essential nature, bred and beaten into you by your masters at Harrow and Eton, is unchanged. Nay, do not protest. I'm not accusing you of being a rake or a wastrel. You've had no opportunity in recent times to exercise those traits common to your class. I am saying that you remain arrogantly convinced of the infallibility of your judgment, that the desires of others are secondary to your superior opinion. You've heard us talk... Sorry, guys. Here, just the glasses. You heard us talking by the fence, he said in a simple declaration, his body sagging. Yes, was the terse reply. The old him would have tried to argue his position, the one he had so often used to justify directing the affairs of others as if they were congruent with his own considerations. To his mind, he never had sought to manipulate his friends and family to promote his well-being. That was left to others like Lady Catherine. Rather, he was so convinced of the clarity of his perspective that he assumed the responsibility for its execution, even if it meant shouldering the burden himself. Losing control was abhorrent to him. He had learned early on in his captivity that this was rooted in the deep insecurity that he had overcome when, as a boy of 12, he could not prevent the death of his mother. Smith had had 6 years to mull that notion. However, as a convict, he likewise had no control over his life and had been forced to accept that fact, or be ground into the dust. Then young Wilson had offered an illuminating tidbit one evening as they had slogged back to their barracks. "I tell you, Will Smith, that what got me here in this coffle was that I was full of that confidence owned by a child who believed the world spun around him. I was not spoiled. That is the nature of any little one who is fed and pampered by loving parents. For me, 'twas until reality slapped me in the face that I realized I could not turn every outcome to my liking, and the world was not mine for the asking." That singular revelation, supplied by a stripling condemned to prison through circumstances he could not control, revealed the rot at the core of his view of self. Smith knew that he had been trying to manage the skeins of his and everyone else's life to prevent the loss of loved ones. This was the greatest arrogance of all. Like the hero in a Greek tragedy, he'd been crushed by the death of his beloved father, the destiny of all men. In his pride, though, Smith blamed himself for not staying the gleaming shears of Atropos. Even then, he had not been inclined to truly amend his character, to put into practice that which he finally had perceived. William Smith had not worked to redeem himself and become the best version of the man his mother birthed until the moment the Lady of the Wood, his siren, rescued him on the banks by the raging waters. Now, for the 3rd time in his life, he was faced with the dreadful prospect that another dear to him might perish, and he had fallen back into the stale waters of his old habits. His reformation was still lacking. Elizabeth had trusted him to be true to her as not only a man faithful to a woman, but also as a person who respects the other enough to expose every facet of his soul. Smith